Hello and welcome to the Operation Archer podcast. My name's Tom Christie. I'm an author and researcher based in Scotland. And today I'll be talking to Dr. Colin Barron, who is the author of Operation Archer. Colin, I know that you've already written a number of non-fiction books, including 5 for Extremis Publishing. What's made you decide to write a novel?
Thank you, Tom. Since I was 17, I've had an ambition to write a thriller novel, but it wasn't until 2018 that I finally achieved that goal. My first non-fiction book on running nursing homes was published in 1990, but I didn't write another book until 2016, when I decided to close down my hypnotherapy business to concentrate on writing books. I always took the view that I would be better to get a few non-fiction books under my belt before I tackled a novel. And that is exactly what I did.
So how did you get the idea for the book?
The starting point for the plot of Operation Archer was a real-life incident in December 1998 when I was doing a one-year hypnotherapy course in Birmingham and underwent a past life regression, during which I remembered being an RAF Lancaster bomber pilot in World War II. So, when I was devising a plot for my first novel, I remembered that episode and I thought to myself, what would happen if someone really did travel back in time to World War II using hypnosis and then couldn't get back? At that point, the story looked a bit like the BBC TV series Life on Mars, only set in 1944, not 1973. And then I thought it would be more interesting to have the hero stranded in Nazi Germany rather than wartime England. And then I had him become involved in a British commando raid on an underground factory which was producing secret weapons. But what would these weapons be? Well, there's a lot on the internet about Nazi flying saucers, which are known as Honebu. So I made them the MacGuffin of the plot. I then added a few more elements to make the story more interesting, such as the hero finding his lost love. And as a nod to Alistair MacLean, a traitor in the commando team, who's actually a die-hard Nazi. My aim was to devise a plot which combined time travel, hypnotherapy, World War II action-adventure, the RAF, the Special Operations Executive, the SAS, air and ground combat, Nazi secret weapons, and a man losing the love of his life and then finding her again. And despite this rather tall order, I succeeded.
And how exactly did you go about writing the book? What was the process behind it?
Well, Tom, I started off by reading a couple of books on the art of novel writing, one of which was written by Frederick E. Smith, the author of 633 Squadron. And then I set myself a tight schedule involving a lot of self-discipline. I determined that I would write the book in just 3 months, from late April to late July 2018, with publication before the end of October 2018. I worked 7 days a week, usually getting up at about 4 AM and doing 2 or 3 hours of writing before my wife got up. As some of you may know, my wife had a very severe stroke in 2011 and requires a lot of care, so I had to do all my writing before her carers got her up at about 7:30 AM. I was also aware that I had to overcome my own self-imposed mental block before I could write fiction, and at times I felt I just couldn't get started. I had a very rough idea of the plot, how the book would begin and how it would end. So the first thing I did was write the prologue, which was very brief. Once I'd done that, I got an idea for the beginning of chapter 1. Once I'd written that, I got an idea for the next paragraph, and then the next one, and so on. A lot of the ideas came spontaneously, and things occurred to me as I was writing, almost like I was obtaining words from an outside source. What would often happen would be that I would see a movie inside my own head and simply describe what I was seeing. I would often use as lines of dialogue things that had been said to me by various people over the last few decades, or that I had said, which I think gave the book greater authenticity. Before I started the book, I learned that there are only 6 basic plots. For example, rags to riches, or riches to rags, or rags to riches and then again to rags. Another common one is boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy finds girl again. But the basic plot I used was the one known in the trade as man in a hole, also known as fall then rise. In other words, the hero is in an impossible situation he is trying to get out of. He has a goal, but he is continually frustrated as things keep going wrong. Just when he thinks he's solved one problem, another appears, and so on. And this makes the story more interesting. A novel in which a commando team flies to Germany to destroy some Nazi flying saucers and everything goes to plan just wouldn't be that interesting. There have to be obstacles that have to be overcome to make the story gripping. And the hero has to achieve his goal, just when it seems all is lost. Eventually, I wrote a very brief chapter summary, which was just 1 sentence per chapter. For example, Paddy Mayne and his SAS team blow up a viaduct in Italy. My first draft came in at 77,000 words. So I went through all the chapters again, putting in a bit more detail. And this second draft came to 84,000 words. So I just left it at this length, even though my original target was 90,000 words, which is about 300 pages.
Operation Archer has a very punchy title. How did that come about?
I spent a lot of time figuring out the title. Originally I was going to call the book Death Flight, but then I found out that there was already a novel with this name. The next title I came up with was Time Flight, but then I remembered that there was a mediocre Doctor Who story from 1982 with that very same title. So I then thought of making the title Operation something. I like military thrillers with the word operation in them. Frederick E. Smith actually wrote several sequels to the book 633 Squadron, which all had the word operation in the title. So he had Operation Cobra, Operation Crucible, Operation Valkyrie, and so on. The 1965 film Operation Crossbow, about the German V weapons, was one of the influences behind my book. So I eventually decided to have a title which was similar. I could have used Operation Longbow, but that's quite a long word, while Operation Strongbow might suggest the book is about a police operation to combat young cider drinkers. So I eventually settled in Operation Archer. I liked that title because Archer is a short word, which is good for a title, because the lettering on the cover can then be quite large. This is something that most people don't realise. You're always better to use a very short word in a headline in a newspaper or for a book title, because then you can use a bigger typeface. And that's the reason that newspapers often use uncommon words like rap, probe, slam and SAR in headlines, because they only have a few letters, resulting in the headlines having a greater vertical height, which looks more dramatic. In the text of my book, it is Churchill himself who calls the mission Operation Archer, because he wants a name similar to Operation Crossbow. By the way, the 1965 film implies that Crossbow was the codename for the intelligence operations against the V weapons, when in fact it only described the RAF missions against V weapons, comprising both photo reconnaissance missions and bombing raids.
In your back cover text, you mention that Operation Archer is inspired by 2 great Alistair MacLean novels, Where Eagles Dare and The Guns of Navarone. Could you say a bit more about this?
I'm a great fan of Alistair MacLean, but I always think his films were actually better than his books, especially Where Eagles Dare, which is a wonderful film, but a mediocre novel. The problem with a lot of MacLean's writing is a total lack of historical and technical accuracy. MacLean was very knowledgeable about ships, as he was in the Royal Navy, but he didn't seem to know much about World War II aircraft, military vehicles, and weapons. You can see this in the novel Where Eagles Dare, in which the commando team parachute out of a Lancaster, an aircraft which was never used for this purpose. And at the end of the book, they are rescued by a de Havilland Mosquito, and there's a scene in which 8 people are crammed into a mosquito fuselage. MacLean obviously thought that the inside of a mosquito was as capacious as a Dakota, when in fact it was very cramped, with barely enough room for the pilot and navigator. In Operation Archer, by comparison, I have the commando team parachuting out a Handley Page Halifax 4-engine bomber, and then being extracted by a Lockheed Hudson, which is entirely accurate, as the SOE used these aircraft to pick up agents in the last 2 years of the war.
Now, one thing that may surprise some readers is that the book contains a number of science fiction elements. Could you say a bit more about that?
This may indeed come as a surprise, but I think the addition of science fiction elements makes the story much more interesting. I can clearly remember watching the first episode of the Patrick Troughton Doctor Who story, The War Games, in April 1969. The trailer the previous week and the write-up in the Radio Times had both suggested that this would be a historical adventure set during the First World War. But of course, about 15 minutes into the first episode, it is revealed that General Smythe has some kind of futuristic video phone, and then we see him using a time travel machine similar to the Doctor's TARDIS. I can well remember the excitement I felt at this revelation, and I don't think The War Games would now be regarded as one of the greatest Doctor Who stories ever if it had been a purely historical adventure. There is something very brain-stretching about science fiction. It really does stimulate the mind, and that is why I included it in the novel.
And that's an interesting point, because former Doctor Who actor Patrick Troughton appears in the novel, but as himself rather than the second Doctor character. Could you say a little bit more about that?
In real life, Patrick Troughton served on Royal Navy motor gunboats during the Second World War. He was originally a first lieutenant and later commanded his own vessel. He never talked about this part of his life, but in my book he plays a crucial role in saving Operation Archer. To find out exactly what he does, you'll need to read the book.
And of course the book also contains a love story. I think many of your readers will be surprised to hear this, given its wartime setting. Why did you include it in the book?
People like to read about other people's emotional problems, and there's no story more powerful than one about a person losing the great love of their life and then maybe finding that person again. What are the most popular TV programmes in the UK? EastEnders, Coronation Street, Emmerdale, all programmes that deal with people's continuing emotional problems and relationship difficulties. I don't often watch these shows myself, but I can understand why many people do, as they are highly addictive because they take viewers on an emotional roller coaster ride. Programmes such as these don't really have happy endings. If 2 characters get married, then something will always go wrong. It's the principle of the emotional roller coaster again. Just when things are going well, something bad happens, and vice versa. One of the most powerful things you can do as a writer is kill off one of your key characters. Jed Mercurio is well known for doing this. He killed off Keeley Hawes' character Julia Montague halfway through the recent BBC thriller Bodyguard. In Operation Archer, I kill off the hero 3 times, and the heroine dies twice. How did I manage to do this? Well, you'll just have to read the book to find out how this occurs. Let's take the example of Star Trek. Many fans of the classic series would agree that the best ever episode was The City on the Edge of Forever, and I think it is because of the emotional core of the story. Kirk travels back to the early 1930s and falls in love with a lady called Edith Keeler, played by Joan Collins. But he has to let her die in order that the Nazis are defeated and our timeline continues as before. It is this personal sacrifice and the emotions it stirs up that has made this story so memorable. It is for the same reason that the original Star Trek pilot, The Cage, and the subsequent 2-parter, The Menagerie, which of course used a lot of footage from The Cage, are also highly regarded by fans. There's a very strong emotional core to the story.
So what were the influences behind the central love story?
One influence behind that part of the storyline was the 1980 film Somewhere in Time. If you can remember that film, which was written by top fantasy writer Richard Matheson, it concerns a playwright, Richard Collier, who is played by Christopher Reeve, who becomes obsessed with a photo of an early 20th century actress called Elise McKenna and travels back to 1912 to meet her. The time travel method used in the film employs a form of self-hypnosis rather than a machine. Another influence on the love story in my book was the 1956 John Wyndham short story Random Quest, which was used as the basis for an episode of the BBC Two science fiction anthology series Out of the Unknown in 1969. In this story, a physicist called Colin Trafford is accidentally transported into a parallel universe in which he is an author married to a beautiful woman called Ottilie Harsham. The marriage is in trouble, but Trafford manages to rekindle the relationship. Just as he has succeeded, he is transported back to his original world. But he believes that a version of Ottilie must exist in his own universe, so he vows to track her down. Eventually, he succeeds.
And of course, the heroine in the book is revealed to have an undiagnosed heart condition.
Random Quest, which I have just mentioned, was made into a film, Quest for Love, in 1971, which starred Tom Bell and Joan Collins. This film is generally considered inferior to the 1969 BBC TV version. However, it did feature an interesting addition to the plot, as Ottilie, who is known as Tracy Fletcher in our world in this version, has an unspecified heart condition which is curable by surgery in our world but not in the alternative universe. So much of the plot in the last part of the film was all about Colin Trafford having to track down Tracy and get her to hospital for urgent surgery. But of course, we're never told exactly what this heart condition is. By a spooky coincidence, my own wife Vivian suffered from an undiagnosed heart tumour called an atrial myxoma, which led to her having a severe stroke in 2011. Some people who develop atrial myxomas can actually die from the condition. So in my novel, part of the plot towards the end of the book involves the hero trying to get his wife operated on to remove the myxoma before it can cause a fatal stroke.
Most books and courses on novel writing emphasise the crucial importance of characterization. Do you have a view on that issue?
I think your characters will stand out as a result of their actions and their dialogue. But I think sometimes there is too much emphasis on characterization at the expense of plot and action. One has only to look at almost every Doctor Who story made in the last few years to see this. There's far too much emphasis on people's backstory, sexuality and their personal problems at the expense of plot and action. I think a good story with lots of action and unexpected plot twists will grab the reader more than a lot of characterization.
The Nazis feature heavily in the book. I notice you take great care to discriminate between the National Socialist German Workers' Party and ordinary German people.
Oh yes, I would discriminate between the Nazis and ordinary Germans. The book does feature some truly evil Nazis, such as Hitler and the principal villain, SS man Karl Müller, who is a sadistic sexual psychopath. But the book does acknowledge that many Germans did not agree with the aims of Nazism and were forced to do terrible things. One of the greatest acts of compassion in the book involves a German fighter pilot who shows mercy and behaves in a very chivalrous fashion. So I would say the book is strongly anti-Nazi, but sympathetic to ordinary Germans who suffered a great deal during the war.
And the book also contains a great deal of detail about planes, tanks and guns. How important do you think this kind of realism is in this particular type of fiction?
I think in this type of book people expect a lot of technical detail, which should be correct. Most writers, for example, don't seem to know that very few Tiger tanks were ever built. Tigers actually accounted for less than 7% of total German tank production, but they're always cropping up in books and films. There are 3 Tigers in Kelly's Heroes. There are Tigers in Saving Private Ryan. And there is a Tiger in Fury. Yet American armoured forces only encountered Tigers on 4 occasions between D-Day and the end of the war. You wouldn't think that from watching most war films or reading war books. In the novelisation of Where Eagles Dare, the Alpine post bus containing the Allied commando team is chased by a Tiger tank at night on winding, slushy Alpine roads. In the book, Captain Corelli's Mandolin, Tiger tanks are deployed to the Greek islands, something that never happened. A lot of writers have got Tiger tanks on the brain because it's the only German tank they know. German tanks do feature in Operation Archer, but they are not Tigers, they are Panzer IVs, which were far more numerous. The Panzer IV was regarded as the workhorse of the German army, but it rarely features in books and films because most writers don't know anything about armoured vehicles.
The hero of Operation Archer is called Simon. How much of Colin Barron do you think is in Simon?
There's always a temptation to base the hero on yourself. Ian Fleming did this with James Bond because Bond is really a wish fulfillment version of Fleming, with a similar background in education and likes and dislikes, particularly as regards food, drink, cigarettes and leisure activities. But they weren't exactly alike. Bond was supposedly an expert driver who was fond of driving fast and doing racing changes, whatever they are, while Fleming was a slow, careful driver who never took risks. So my hero Simon has some of my characteristics, but not all of them. One of the great turning points of my life came in August 1973, when I had to choose what to do for my career. I had a choice between medicine and electrical engineering. I chose medicine. In my book, Simon is faced with the same choice and goes in for electrical engineering, but he maintains an interest in the workings of the human mind and is even considering becoming a hypnotherapist. I should explain that the book is set in 2 time zones, namely the present day and 1944. The Simon in 2019 has many of the same likes and dislikes as me. He loves cooked breakfast, Chinese food, beer and making Airfix models.
And I must ask you about the very striking cover, which shows Spitfires intercepting a Nazi flying saucer. Who was responsible for this really striking artwork?
That's the work of my cousin James Culver, who's a professional graphic designer. I had a vision of a cover featuring an Allied fighter intercepting a German flying saucer, and I thought this would be a very striking image, and I think James has done a superb job of interpreting my idea into something that really catches the eye and is very memorable.
Having read the book, I feel it has a very filmic structure because you write in a very visual way. Given this kind of cinematic quality, would you like to see a film of Operation Archer at some point?
I think a film could be made of Operation Archer, and it would be very exciting. Whether a film will actually be made is another matter, because it would be a very expensive film to make because of all the tanks, military vehicle and aircraft that would be required. Many of the aircraft which appear in the book don't even exist anymore. There are no airworthy Handley Page Halifaxes, Dornier 217s, Junkers 88s or Messerschmitt 110s anywhere in the world. There is only one airworthy Lockheed Hudson in the world, and this is in Australia. So any movie would be difficult and expensive to make, as many of the aircraft would have to be depicted by CGI or miniatures. Personally, I despair at the current trends in Hollywood. Producers only seem to be interested in prequels, sequels, remakes and reboots, films about superheroes, and films based on video games. Anything totally original is a no-go, and the British film industry, if you can call it that, is obsessed with political correctness and diversity to a ridiculous degree. You only have to look at that recent awful British film about the Entebbe raid to see what I mean.
And if there ever was to be a film of the book, who would you ideally like to choose as the director?
There are just 4 directors in the world who I think would be capable of doing it justice, namely Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, Ridley Scott and Christopher Nolan. Of the 4, I think James Cameron would be the best choice, because the story of Operation Archer contains themes that are found in many of Cameron's movies, such as time travel and a gutsy female heroine. And I think he would enjoy the great amount of technical detail that is to be found in the book.
And finally, do you have any plans for any further novels?
Yes, I do plan to write 1 fiction and 1 non-fiction book every year for the rest of my life. So there will be another novel next year, so it's just a case of stay tuned.
Well, Colin, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today and to discuss your novel. I found it to be a very interesting, action-packed and exciting fictional experience, and one which I think will be of great interest both to fans of wartime drama, fans of science fiction, and anyone who just enjoys a really involving story. So, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Tom.